The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving behind an oppressive blanket of darkness that smothered the small town of Black Hollow. The air was thick and damp, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of decay. Black Hollow was no stranger to whispers of strange occurrences, but what happened on that particular October night would cement its place in the annals of terror. In the heart of the town stood the Crowmore Asylum, an abandoned structure that loomed like a gaping wound against the skyline. For decades, locals avoided it, speaking only in hushed tones of the experiments that had taken place within its walls. Those who ventured near claimed they could hear whispers that didn't belong to the living and see fleeting shadows that defied explanation. It was precisely this notoriety that lured a group of thrill-seeking college students to its gates. Emma, the reluctant skeptic, had been dragged along by her boyfriend Nate and his friends Chelsea and Mike. They carried flashlights, cameras, and enough bravado to fill the vast, crumbling halls of the asylum. The iron gates groaned as Nate pushed them open, the sound echoing like a death knell. Emma hesitated, her stomach nodding, but she followed the others inside, her flashlight trembling in her grasp. Inside the asylum was a maze of decay and rot. Peeling wallpaper revealed sinister graffiti underneath, and the air was heavy with the scent of mildew. Chelsea shone her flashlight on a series of old patient files scattered across the floor. "Look at this," she said, picking one up. The name on the file read, Subject 12, Evelyn Ray. Scrawled in red ink below it was a single word, unrecoverable. A shiver ran through Emma as Chelsea read aloud. Unrecoverable? What does that even mean? Just some spooky doctor speak, Nate said with a smirk, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. They pressed on, their footsteps crunching over shards of glass and debris. The further they ventured, the colder it became. Emma's breath came out in frosty puffs, though the others didn't seem to notice. As they reached the main hall, the group stopped in their tracks. On the wall, written in what looked like dried blood, was a single chilling phrase, "She never left." Beneath it, a long crack stretched across the wall like a jagged smile. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Mike muttered, his bravado wavering. As they turned to explore the second floor, Emma's flashlight flickered and died. She smacked it against her palm, but it refused to come back to life. The others' flashlights began to dim as well until the group was swallowed by darkness. Panic bubbled in Emma's chest. "Guys, I think we should leave," she whispered, her knees up, but her voice felt muffled, as if the air itself were pressing in on her. Then came the whispers. Low, guttural murmurs seemed to rise from the walls themselves, unintelligible yet filled with malice. The sound grew louder, a cacophony of overlapping voices. Chelsea screamed as something cold brushed against her arm. "What was that?" she cried, clutching at Mike. "Stay close," Nate shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The group huddled together, their breaths shallow. A faint, flickering light appeared at the end of the hall, a pale, sickly glow that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. Drawn by a mix of terror and morbid curiosity, they moved toward it. The light led them to a room with a rusted metal door that hung ajar. Inside, the walls were lined with old restraints and surgical tools, their surfaces stained with time and something darker. In the center of the room stood a single upright gurney. Strapped to it was a desiccated figure by its head lolling forward. The body's sunken eye sockets seemed to watch them even in death. Then the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. Without warning, the figure's head snapped upright, its empty sockets filling with a crimson glow. The restraints holding it creaked and snapped, and the creature lurched forward, moving with unnatural speed. Emma screamed as the group bolted for the door. They ran blindly through the halls, like chased by the sound of inhuman screeches and pounding footsteps that seemed to come from all directions. Every turn led them deeper into the asylum's labyrinthine depths. One by one, the group began to vanish. Mike was the first to fall, pulled into the shadows by unseen hands. His screams were cut off abruptly. Chelsea disappeared next, her flashlight spinning on the floor before it flickered out. By the time Emma and Nate reached the main entrance, only Emma remained. She stumbled through the gates, her lungs burning, only to find the town empty. The streets were deserted, the lights in the houses dark. She turned to Nate, but his expression was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Nate?" she whispered, shaking him. He opened his mouth, but instead of words, a guttural voice spilled out, echoing the asylum's whispers. His body contorted, and Emma watched in horror as his face twisted into something unrecognizable. He lunged at her, his movements unnatural and jerky. Emma ran, the sounds of Nate's inhuman laughter chasing her into the night. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of town, where she collapsed in exhaustion. When she finally looked back, Black Hollow was gone. The town, the asylum, and Nate all swallowed by the darkness. All that remained was an endless expanse of trees and an eerie silence that promised she was not alone. Emma never spoke of that night, but those who passed her on the street could see it in her eyes. She'd been somewhere no one should ever go, and something had followed her back.
Story number 2.
The night was alive with a howling wind that twisted through the hollow streets of Ravenswood, a town nestled deep in the woods and cloaked in perpetual gloom. Few dared to remain after dark, but for 17-year-old Clara, the danger was part of the allure. She and her best friends, Liam, Harper, and Danny, had decided to spend the evening in the abandoned Ravenswood orphanage, a decaying relic of a bygone era. The orphanage had been closed for decades, steeped in gruesome lore about missing children and sinister caretakers. Locals whispered about a headmistress named Agnes Dreer, known for her cruelty. Rumors claimed she had a peculiar way of dealing with disobedient children. She would send them to the Silent Room. None of those sent there were ever seen again. The group arrived just before midnight, armed with flashlights and nerves of steel, or so they thought. The orphanage was a looming specter, its Gothic architecture riddled with shattered windows that glared like empty eyes. The iron gates squealed as they pushed them open, sending a shiver through Clara. "Creepy enough for you?" Liam asked with a smirk, though his voice betrayed his unease. "Perfect," Clara replied, masking her fear with bravado. They stepped inside, their flashlights casting long, dancing shadows on the cracked walls. The smell of mildew and rot was suffocating. The floorboards groaned underfoot as they moved through the entryway. Faded, grimy wallpaper adorned the walls, and a large staircase spiraled into the darkness above. The first few rooms were empty, save for broken furniture and forgotten toys. But as they ventured deeper, they found themselves standing before a door unlike the others. Its wood was pristine, unmarked by time or decay. Above it, a hand-carved sign read, "The Silent Room." "No way," Harper whispered, clutching Danny's arm. Clara's heart thudded in her chest, but she stepped forward. "It's just a door," she said, her voice trembling. Liam nudged it open. The hinges moved silently as if the door had been used just yesterday. The room beyond was stark and cold. A single chair stood in the center, its surface polished to a mirror-like shine. On the walls, dozens of handprints were smeared in dried blood, small and frantic, as if made by children trying to escape. "All right, this is officially messed up," Danny said, backing away. Before anyone could reply, the door slammed shut behind them. Their flashlights flickered, and the air grew heavy, oppressive. A deep, guttural voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Stay. Forever." Panic surged through the group. Clara rattled the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Harper screamed as the shadows in the corners of the room began to twist and writhe, taking on grotesque forms. One by one, the shadows emerged, their shapes vaguely human but horribly wrong. Their faces were featureless except for hollow, black mouths that stretched impossibly wide. The creatures advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural, the air filled with a low, bone-chilling hum that vibrated in their skulls. Harper stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the floor. A shadow lunged, enveloping her in its dark tendrils. Her scream cut off abruptly, leaving only the hum. "Harper!" Danny shouted, but she was gone. Nothing remained but the faint outline of her handprint on the wall. Liam grabbed Clara's arm. "We have to get out of here," he yelled, dragging her toward the door. As they pounded on it, the chair in the center of the room began to move. It scraped across the floor with an ear-splitting screech, turning to face them. In the chair sat a figure, a woman with hollow eyes and a stitched mouth, her head tilted unnaturally as she raised a bony hand and pointed at Clara. The stitches on her mouth began to snap, one by one, releasing a sound that wasn't a voice, but a horrible, guttural noise like the grinding of teeth. Danny ran toward the shadows, screaming Harper's name, but they engulfed him too. His flashlight rolled across the floor, illuminating the woman's face for a brief moment. Her eyes were pools of black, and her mouth gaped open, wider and wider, until it was nothing but a void. Liam and Clara were the last. The walls seemed to close in, the handprints growing darker and wetter. The hum turned into a deafening roar, and the shadows circled them. Liam stepped forward, trying to shield Clara, but a shadow wrapped around his neck, dragging him into the void. His last scream echoed through the room. Clara was alone. The figure in the chair rose, her movements impossibly slow and deliberate. Clara's legs felt like lead, her body frozen in terror. The woman leaned in close, her stitched mouth whispering a single word in Clara's ear. "Stay." The lights went out completely and the room fell silent. When the townspeople found the orphanage weeks later, they discovered the door to the silent room wide open. Inside, the chair stood empty, but the walls were covered with fresh handprints, one of them larger than the rest, smeared in a frantic streak as if someone had tried to escape. Clara's handprint. No one dared enter the room again. The orphanage was sealed off, but at night, passers-by claimed they could hear faint screams and the sound of children whispering, "Stay with us forever."
Story number 3.
The rain was relentless that night, pounding against the windows of the old manor, like desperate fingers trying to claw their way inside. Lydia had inherited the estate from an estranged great-uncle she'd never met, a man whose name was barely spoken in her family. The lawyer had assured her the house was in good condition despite its age, but as she stood in the grand foyer, she felt the weight of years pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. The house seemed alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wooden beams in the storm, felt like a warning. Still, Lydia couldn't afford to be superstitious. She had recently lost her job and her apartment, and the manor was a gift from nowhere. If she could bear living in it, she might just turn her luck around. That first night, she unpacked only the essentials and settled into the smallest bedroom, the one that felt least oppressive. The other rooms were too large, too cold, and filled with antique furniture that seemed to watch her as she moved. She tried to ignore the unsettling sensation that she wasn't alone. Around midnight, she woke to the sound of footsteps above her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the heavy, deliberate thuds continued, pacing back and forth across the ceiling. Her heart raced. The attic. She hadn't thought to check it when she arrived. Gripping a flashlight, Lydia climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The door was ajar, swinging gently as though inviting her in. She hesitated but pushed it open, her flashlight beam cutting through the dusty gloom. The attic was empty except for a single object, a large, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. Its gilded frame was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. The glass itself was flawless, reflecting her wide-eyed face and the dark expanse of the attic behind her. As she approached the mirror, her reflection seemed wrong. Her movements were ever so slightly out of sync, like a delay on an old video feed. She waved her hand, and her reflection mimicked her, but a heartbeat too late. Lydia's stomach churned. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, and the attic was plunged into darkness. She fumbled with the switch, her breath hitching, and when the light returned, her reflection was no longer alone. A figure stood behind her in the glass, a tall, shadowy man with hollow eyes and a crooked smile that stretched far too wide. Lydia spun around, but the attic was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the man was gone, but her reflection remained frozen, staring at her with an expression of sheer terror. Then it moved, independent of her. It raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, mouthing a single, soundless word. "Run." The flashlight went out again, and this time it wouldn't turn back on. Lydia stumbled down the attic stairs, heart hammering in her chest. She reached the bedroom and slammed the door shut, barricading it with a chair. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Lydia sat on the bed, clutching her knees, trying to convince herself it was all in her head. But then she heard it, a faint tapping at the bedroom window. She didn't want to look, but something compelled her. She turned her head slowly, and there, pressed against the glass, was a pale, gaunt face. Its eyes were hollow, black voids, and its crooked smile stretched impossibly wide. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at her. Lydia screamed, but when she blinked, the face was gone. The window was empty, rain streaking down the panes. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the storm, her imagination running wild. But then the tapping came again. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was coming from the mirror in her bedroom. The ornate frame was glowing faintly, the glass rippling like water. Lydia backed away as the surface of the mirror bulged outward, as though something on the other side was trying to push through. A hand emerged first, bony, pale, and clawed. Then came the rest of the figure, its hollow eyes locked on her as it crawled out of the mirror. The crooked smile never wavered. Lydia ran, flinging the barricade aside and racing down the hall. The walls seemed to close in around her, the house groaning as though alive. She reached the front door, only to find it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the thing from the mirror was following, its movements jerky and unnatural. She darted into the dining room and grabbed the first weapon-like object she could find, a rusted fire poker. The creature entered, its smile impossibly wider now, stretching from ear to ear. It didn't speak, but its hollow eyes conveyed a terrifying promise. You can't leave. With a scream, Lydia swung the poker, shattering the mirror that hung on the wall. The creature let out an unearthly screech, collapsing into a pile of black smoke. The house fell silent. Lydia fled the manor that night, abandoning everything she owned. She never spoke of what she saw, but the house still stands, its windows watching. Some say if you pass by at night, you can see your reflection in them. Only it doesn't look quite like you.
Story number 4.
The fog rolled in thick and fast that night, swallowing the small seaside town of Gray Harbor. The air was damp and carried a faint, acrid smell that made Emma's nose wrinkle as she walked along the boardwalk. She'd always hated the fog, but tonight it felt different, denser, almost alive. The distant tolling of the old lighthouse bell echoed eerily, though the lighthouse itself had been abandoned for years. Emma was on her way home from the late shift at the diner. The streets were unnervingly quiet, the usual hum of distant traffic and crashing waves muffled to an unnatural silence. She quickened her pace, clutching her coat tighter around her body. As she passed an alley, a soft sound stopped her in her tracks. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down her spine. A whisper, low and guttural, slithered through the air. Emma. She froze. Her name had been spoken, of that she was certain, but it wasn't a voice she recognized. It sounded close, too close, yet the alley was empty. The fog swirled, thickening like smoke, and the shadows at the alley's end seemed to ripple. "Who's there?" Emma called, her voice trembling. Silence. She forced herself to keep walking, her boots clattering against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. The bell from the lighthouse rang again, louder this time, and she stopped once more. The sound was wrong. The rhythm felt almost deliberate, like a pattern or a code. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she nearly dropped it in surprise. Pulling it out, she saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" she whispered. A crackling silence greeted her, followed by a faint, echoing sound. It was the toll of the lighthouse bell, but distorted like it was underwater. Then came the voice, raspy and broken, as though spoken through shattered glass. "You should not be here." The call ended abruptly, and Emma's blood ran cold. She turned to look at the lighthouse in the distance. Its beam of light, long extinguished, now shone faintly through the fog, sweeping across the town like an unseeing eye. Emma's fear turned to dread when she realized something else. The beam wasn't random. It was following her. Her breathing quickened as she broke into a run, her footsteps echoing loudly. The light from the lighthouse pursued her, its reach extending impossibly far. Shadows writhed in the fog, their shapes grotesque and unnatural. She stumbled into a small park near the edge of the boardwalk, collapsing onto a bench. Her hands trembled as she tried to call someone, anyone, but her phone was dead. The fog thickened further, pressing against her skin like icy fingers. Then she saw it. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, standing unnaturally still in the fog. But as the beam of the lighthouse swept over it, she saw it more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and spindly. Its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, and its face, or what should have been a face, was obscured by shadows. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Emma felt its presence seep into her bones like venom. The bell tolled again, and this time it was deafening. Emma screamed, covering her ears as the sound reverberated through her skull. When she opened her eyes, the figure was closer. It hadn't walked. It had simply appeared. She stumbled to her feet, backing away. "Stay back!" she shouted, though she doubted the thing would listen, or even understand. The figure raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and ending in sharp, blade-like tips. The lighthouse beam swept over them both, and for a brief moment Emma saw its face. or rather, the lack of one. Its head was featureless, but a gaping hole where a mouth should be opened, releasing a low, guttural growl that made her knees buckle. She turned and ran, her heart hammering against her ribcage. The lighthouse beam flickered and went dark, plunging the town into an oppressive blackness. But she could hear it behind her. The thing's steps, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. Emma reached the diner, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it, her chest heaving as she pressed her back against the door. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps against the glass of the diner's front window. Emma didn't dare look. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying it would go away. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of scraping. It was at the door now, dragging those blade-like fingers across the metal frame. Emma's breath hitched as the air grew colder. Finally, she opened her eyes. The thing was standing outside, its featureless face pressed against the glass, its head tilted as if studying her. The mouth hole widened, and a voice echoed in her mind, a voice like the tolling of the bell. "You cannot escape. You belong to the fog now." The lights flickered one last time and went out, plunging the diner into darkness. Emma screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. When the sun rose over Gray Harbor, the fog dissipated, revealing an empty boardwalk and a silent town. The diner was locked from the inside, but Emma was gone. Locals say if you stand by the shore at night, you can hear the lighthouse bell tolling faintly in the distance, and sometimes if the fog is thick enough, you'll see her. A shadowy figure running endlessly along the boardwalk, chased by something that never lets her go.
Story number 5.
The little town of Black Hollow was known for its eerie forest, a sprawling mass of ancient trees that seemed to breathe with the wind. Locals called it the Whispering Woods because on still nights you could hear voices, soft, hushed, and impossible to ignore. No one who wandered too deep into the woods ever came back. Sarah had grown up in Black Hollow, and like most townsfolk, she avoided the woods. But tonight was different. Her younger brother, Max, had gone missing after a dare from his friends to retrieve an old pocket watch, rumored to be hidden in the forest. The boys returned, pale-faced and trembling, swearing they'd heard Max call out, but no one could find him. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy sense of dread, Sarah ventured into the Whispering Woods as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest swallowed the light almost immediately, and the air grew colder with each step. The trees loomed overhead like skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. "Max!" she called, her voice trembling. The woods answered with a whisper. "Sarah?" She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, but unmistakably her name. The flashlight beam trembled as she scanned the underbrush. There was no sign of anyone, just the dense tangle of trees and shadows. "Max, is that you?" she called again, more desperate this time. The whisper came again, closer now. "Sarah, help!" The voice sounded just like Max, but something about it was off, too hollow, too stretched. She pressed forward, her boots crunching against the dead leaves and brittle twigs. The forest seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, and the whispers grew louder, multiplying. "Sarah, come closer." She stopped when she found the pocket watch. It was lying on a moss-covered stone, its glass cracked and its hands frozen at midnight. She reached for it, but as her fingers brushed the cold metal, the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was suffocating. A low, guttural growl broke the stillness. Sarah whipped around, her flashlight catching a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness. The thing stepped into the beam, a creature that barely resembled anything human. Its body was gaunt and twisted, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was a grotesque imitation of Max's. The features stretched and wrong, as though someone had tried to carve a mask from memory. "Sarah," it crooned, in Max's voice, but warped like a record played backward. "Stay with me." She stumbled back, tripping over the stone. The creature moved closer, its joints cracking with every step. Its hand, skeletal and clawed, reached out, but she scrambled to her feet and ran. The forest seemed to shift around her, the trees closing in, their branches grasping at her like desperate fingers. The whispers returned, deafening now, overlapping and chaotic. "Don't leave. Stay. You can't escape." She ran until her legs burned, until her lungs felt like they would burst. The flashlight flickered, its beam dimming with every passing second. She thought she saw the edge of the forest ahead, the faint glow of the town lights, but then she tripped, falling hard onto the forest floor. The whispers stopped again. She turned over, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature was standing over her now, its hollow eyes boring into hers. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, glistening teeth. From deep within its throat, Max's voice emerged, weak and pleading. "Sarah, please, don't let it take me." Tears streamed down her face as she screamed, swinging the flashlight at the thing's head. It shattered on impact, plunging her into complete darkness. She scrambled to her feet, running blindly, guided only by instinct and the faint memory of where she'd entered the woods. The whispers followed her, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. She burst out of the forest and into the cold, open air of the town. Her knees gave out and she collapsed on the dirt road, sobbing. The search party found her the next morning, huddled on the edge of the woods. She tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. Max's body was never found, and the whispers in the woods grew quieter for a time. But Sarah knew better. The forest hadn't let him go. It had taken him, twisted him, and now it was waiting for her. Sometimes late at night, when the wind was still, she swore she could hear him calling her name. "Sarah, come back."
Story number 6.
The little house on Blackthorn Road had been abandoned for decades. Its peeling paint, broken windows, and sagging roof made it a place of morbid fascination for the townspeople. Whispers surrounded it, stories of a family that had vanished overnight, of strange lights seen in the windows, and of screams that echoed in the dead of night. Ellie didn't believe in ghosts. She was a skeptic through and through, and when her friends dared her to spend one night in the Blackthorn house, she accepted without hesitation. Armed with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and her phone to document the experience, she stepped into the rotting skeleton of the old house. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the scent of mold and decay. Her footsteps echoed in the empty halls as she explored, flashlight beam revealing cobweb-covered furniture and crumbling wallpaper. The place was a time capsule of a life abruptly interrupted. Ellie set up camp in the living room, unfurling her sleeping bag on the dusty floor. She spent the first few hours taking videos mocking the supposed hauntings. "See," she said into her camera, panning around the room. "No ghosts, no demons, just an old, creepy house. This place isn't haunted, it's just falling apart." As the night deepened, the house settled into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the wood or the distant sound of the wind outside. Ellie tried to ignore the growing unease gnawing at her. She reminded herself it was all in her head. But then at 2:47 a.m., she heard it. A faint sound like a child giggling came from upstairs. Her heart froze. She strained her ears, hoping she'd imagined it, but there it was again. Soft, high-pitched laughter that sent chills racing down her spine. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The laughter stopped, replaced by a series of soft thuds, like small, bare feet running across the floor above her. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Every rational part of her screamed to leave, but curiosity, or pride, held her in place. She grabbed her flashlight and ascended the creaking staircase. The air grew colder with every step, and a strange metallic smell filled her nose. The hallway at the top was lined with doors, all slightly ajar. Her flashlight's beam trembled as she swept it across each one. "Is someone there?" she whispered. One of the doors creaked open, slow and deliberate. Ellie swallowed hard and approached it, her hands slick with sweat. The room beyond was a child's bedroom, frozen in time. A small bed with a faded quilt sat against the wall, surrounded by old toys and a rocking horse. The rocking horse moved. Ellie stepped back, her flashlight fixed on the toy as it swayed back and forth, its creaks loud in the oppressive silence. She turned to leave, but a voice stopped her dead in her tracks. "Stay and play with us." The voice was soft, childlike, but wrong. It echoed as though coming from all around her. Ellie spun back toward the room and gasped. The shadows in the corner had taken shape, two small figures with hollow, empty eyes and mouths stretched into grotesque smiles. "Stay and play," they repeated in unison, stepping closer. Ellie bolted, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she tore down the stairs. She stumbled into the living room, grabbing her phone, but the screen was black. The front door, which she had left slightly ajar, was now closed and locked. A slow, deliberate knock echoed from the door. She backed away, her heart pounding in her ears. The knock came again, louder this time. Then a voice, deep and guttural, whispered through the cracks of the door. "You shouldn't have come." The walls around her groaned as if the house itself were alive. The shadows stretched unnaturally, creeping toward her like grasping hands. Ellie screamed, throwing her weight against the door. It wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the dim light. Behind her, she heard the sound of the rocking horse creaking again, and the children's voices returned, louder and more insistent. "Stay! Stay! Stay!" Ellie closed her eyes, whispering desperate prayers, until suddenly the noise stopped. The house fell silent. She opened her eyes to find the door wide open, the night air beckoning her to leave. Without hesitation, she ran, not stopping until she reached the safety of her car. She never spoke of what she saw that night, but she wasn't the last to accept the dare. The house still stands, its windows dark and uninviting. Locals swear that on certain nights, if you stand outside and listen closely, you can hear the faint sound of laughter and a voice whispering, "Stay and play."
Story number 7.
The road through Ravenswood Forest was infamous. Travelers avoided it whenever possible, recounting tales of people who vanished without a trace, their cries echoing through the dense ancient trees. Yet, for Alex, it was a shortcut, a necessary risk to make it to the job interview in the next town. The night was moonless, and the headlights of Alex's car barely cut through the suffocating darkness. The trees seemed alive, their gnarled branches forming clawed hands that arched overhead. The sound of the engine was the only noise, as though the forest had swallowed all other sounds. About halfway through the forest, the car began to sputter. Alex cursed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The engine died completely, and the car rolled to a halt. The silence was deafening. Alex's phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. Grabbing a flashlight, Alex stepped out into the chill night air. The forest loomed on all sides, an oppressive wall of black. The wind picked up, carrying a faint, metallic tang that made Alex's stomach churn. A soft sound broke the stillness. A faint, distant humming. It was melodic, almost sweet, but it sent a chill down Alex's spine. Shining the flashlight into the trees, Alex saw nothing but dense underbrush and twisting roots. "Hello?" Alex called, the words barely audible over the rapid thudding of their heart. The humming stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from deeper in the woods, came a sound that froze Alex in place. A laugh. It was high-pitched and childlike, but it carried a sinister edge, like something pretending to be human. "Who's there?" Alex demanded, voice shaking. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She wore a tattered white dress, stained and torn, her hair wild and unkempt. Her face was obscured by the darkness, but her movements were jerky, unnatural, as though her limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice soft and lilting. Alex took a step back. "My car broke down? Do you have a phone?" The woman tilted her head, the movement sharp and unnatural. "A phone?" she repeated, as though unfamiliar with the word. She took a step closer, her bare feet silent against the forest floor. Alex's flashlight flickered, and for a split second the woman's face was illuminated. It was wrong. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth stretched far too wide, filled with jagged, yellow teeth. The light went out completely, plunging Alex into darkness. Panicking, Alex turned and ran back to the car, fumbling to get inside and lock the doors. The flashlight wouldn't turn back on, and the only light came from the faint glow of the dashboard. Alex's breath fogged up the windows as they tried to calm down. A soft tapping on the glass made them freeze. The woman was there, her empty eyes pressed against the driver's side window. Her mouth didn't move, but Alex could hear her voice inside their head. "Let me in." Alex screamed and fumbled with the keys, trying to start the car. The engine groaned but refused to turn over. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The woman's voice filled the car, louder now, more commanding. "Let me in." The windshield cracked as something heavy slammed against it. Alex looked up to see more figures emerging from the woods, dozens of them, all with hollow eyes and twisted, jagged smiles. They surrounded the car, their hands pounding on the glass in unison. The dashboard lights flickered, and the radio crackled to life. A static-filled voice whispered through the speakers. "You shouldn't have come here." With a final desperate twist of the key, the engine roared to life. Alex slammed the car into gear and sped down the road, the figures disappearing into the darkness behind them. The forest seemed to scream as the car tore through it, the trees closing in like they were alive. When Alex finally emerged from Ravenswood, the car shuddered to a halt again. Looking back, the forest loomed like a living thing, the shadows within it writhing. Alex didn't dare linger, abandoning the car and running the rest of the way to town. The mechanic who towed the car the next day found deep scratches along the windows and hood, as though something had tried to claw its way inside. Alex left the town without attending the interview, swearing never to return. Locals say the road through Ravenswood still claims travelers who dare to pass through at night. And sometimes, if you listen closely as you drive, you'll hear a soft tapping on your windows, followed by a voice whispering, "Let me in."
Story number 8.
The town of Ashmere had one rule everyone followed: don't go near the well after dark. The well sat in the middle of the town square, a relic of Ashmere's founding days. Its weathered stones were covered in moss, and the wooden cover was warped with age. Most of the townsfolk avoided it altogether, not just at night. Children whispered stories of strange sounds coming from its depths, and even the bravest dared not lean too close. Callum didn't believe in superstitions. A newcomer to Ashmere, he thought the stories about the well were just small-town folklore meant to scare people. So when his friends dared him to visit the well one night, he scoffed and agreed without hesitation. It was a moonless night when Callum approached the square. The air was unnaturally cold, and a heavy silence blanketed the town. His flashlight cast long, distorted shadows as he made his way to the well. Despite his confidence, he felt an unshakable unease creep over him as he stood before it. The well seemed larger up close, its stones looming like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. The wooden cover was slightly askew, and a faint draft of cold air whispered out from the dark below. "See?" Callum muttered to himself, trying to ignore the growing knot of dread in his stomach. Just a hole in the ground. He stepped closer and peered into the darkness. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the void, revealing only the faint glint of damp stones. A soft sound drifted up, so faint he almost missed it. A low, mournful hum, like a melody sung underwater. Callum froze. His rational mind screamed it was the wind, but something about the sound felt wrong. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm, almost like a voice. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, deep from within the well, a voice echoed back, faint but clear. "Help me." Callum's blood ran cold. It was a woman's voice, fragile and desperate. Every instinct told him to run, but his curiosity, or perhaps his pride, kept him rooted in place. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Please, I'm trapped," the voice pleaded, growing louder. "I've been down here for so long." Callum leaned closer, trying to see into the darkness. The draft from the well grew stronger, carrying with it a sharp, metallic smell that made his stomach churn. "Are you hurt?" he asked, gripping the edge of the well. The voice didn't answer. Instead, there was a soft scraping sound, like something climbing. Callum backed away, his flashlight trembling as he shone it into the depths. The beam caught movement, a pale hand, thin and skeletal, gripping the stones, then another. The figure that emerged was not human. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched taut over bone. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a woman's, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched far too wide. "Thank you," it whispered, its voice no longer desperate but filled with malice. "I was so lonely." Callum screamed and stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. He turned to run, but the thing moved impossibly fast, crawling out of the well and blocking his path. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and he felt a crushing weight in his chest, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. "No one leaves the well," it hissed, its voice a guttural growl now. "Stay with me." The last thing Callum saw was its mouth stretching open, an endless void that consumed the darkness around him. The next morning, the townsfolk found the well's cover sealed tightly, as though it had never been disturbed. There was no sign of Callum, just his flashlight lying abandoned in the square. No one mentioned his disappearance. They didn't have to. The town of Ashmere had always known the well was cursed, and now it had claimed another. To this day, if you stand by the well at night and listen closely, you might hear it. A faint voice calling from the depths, begging for help. But everyone knows better than to answer. Because once you do, it's already too late.